Hi guys, I'm Katie Room from Periapsis Press, and today we are going to do an episode of The Signal where we talk about some reading-related topic, usually discussing an article. And today I have an interesting one that came out, I believe, in March while I was sick, March 21st. I put the link in the description if you want to read along. Otherwise, I'll put it up on my screen. This was put up by Lorehaven. I pull from them a lot because I almost agree with them a lot. So this one should make for an interesting stream, I think. Oh, you know what I should do is I should make sure. David always reminds me that I need to make sure to say, guys, I'm live. So people know that they can join in. So I better do that. There. Now I've done my due diligence, right? Okay. So this article was, here, I'll make sure to share it right on my screen here. Written by Jasmine Fisher. I'm not familiar with everybody who writes on Lorehaven. I think it's a really interesting article, and there are points where I'm like, absolutely, yes, of course. One of the obvious being you should be reading your Bible, and another obvious one being you probably shouldn't read porn. But I think that the way that she talks about the topic as a whole, phrasing it in such a way where reading healthy books or in a healthy way is juxtaposed against reading escapist is very interesting and kind of counter to my slogan. People on Twitter know that I say frequently, you should read what you want, read whatever you want, as long as you're reading. And the caveat to that is, of course, you shouldn't be reading things that are outright sinful, for example, porn. Hi to Anne. Thank you for coming. Feel free to chime in whenever. I will try to keep an eye on the comments while I'm also reading this article. So yeah, she opens the article talking about J.R.R. Tolkien with his famous quote about escapism and escaping through books. Then she continues with, but has speculative fiction changed since Tolkien's declaration, or have readers? A question she never really answers, I think. What does escapism in fantasy look like today? Is it still good and defensible? Or do our favorite books change our brains for better or worse? Her opinion on this last point is, yes, they change our brains. And so it's a little bit of it's a question she doesn't explore. It's a question that she assumes an answer to. But I don't really think that she really addresses the escapism angle of it. Maybe in a reread here with you guys, I'll see better what her point is. So she goes on to talk about her diet. And this is where she starts to talk about reading in the framework of things that you're putting into your body should be healthy. And she bridges this by making the assumption that some books are escapism and other books are healthy. So I think that's wrong. And I think it would be more correct to say, like here in her sort of subtitle or her tag, since the escapism calls from J.R.R. Tolkien and Ursula K. Le Guin, fictional fantasy has taken a turn towards shallow and sensual themes that can hurt us. And I think the themes part is important in a way that you don't necessarily know by just saying genre or tropes or like feel-good fiction, right? So her point here. Oh, hi, William Jeffrey Rankin. Thank you for coming. Whoops, wrong one. There we go. Here we go. Okay. More stories are taking sugary shortcuts to please our tastes. In recent years, the sociocultural intake of the West has changed as much as our food preferences. As many have noted, audiences increasingly prefer films that fall lighter on our brains, hence the recent proliferation of live-action remakes, reworkings of old classics, or movies inspired by toys and video games. That's an interesting argument. I understand the premise, and I think probably there is some of that. When we sit down to be entertained, we don't necessarily want something that is always complex, or making us think, where a lot of people sit down to watch TV to relax. And this point that she uses in support of that doesn't really equate, because we know that there is a lot of pushback right now against live action remakes, old, classic retelling, but with subversion, right? And right now, movies inspired by toys and video games, people are on the edge of their seat watching all of the trailers and stuff leading up to it, trying to decide, oh, is this going to be a good one, or is it just going to be stupid or subversive or not actually fun, but a propaganda piece, right? So there are other reasons why there is a proliferation of those kinds of films. So, and part of that is the push to appeal to the lowest common denominator, make something for everyone, which is not necessarily how people choose books. So I think I'm not in complete disagreement that our tastes in the West have changed, as much as I don't think that she is necessarily creating a good argument for that. And then this part, I'm particularly in disagreement with. I think cognitive shortcuts also abound. Marketers sell more fantasy books using the X meets Y formula, which Fiona Woolf and I would say is a poor formula. Or they use checklists of beloved tropes, like enemies to lovers, grumpy / sunshine, and he falls first. Thanks to our overstimulated brains, world-weary souls, and emptier wallets, we're less likely to risk uncharted territory or unproven authors. Instead, we revert to nostalgic tropery fandoms or reimagined fairy tales. We want escapist entertainment, but we also want traces of the familiar amidst the strange. I if you guys watch my channel or if you read my reviews of indie books, you know that I love a good trope. I don't think that tropes are bad. Enemies to lovers, Grumpy/Sunshine, he falls first. Those are all romance tropes. And they communicate something very specific to the reader that say, you will like this, or this is not for you. Those are important marketing things, right? And just because a book is marketed well does not mean that the reader is wrong to pick up that book. And just because a reader knows what they're looking for doesn't mean that the trope is sort of making a sort of unhealthy, like she says, cognitive shortcut. We're skipping over something that should be more complex. That's not necessarily true, because the story doesn't go, okay, enemies to lovers, and that's the end. They lived happily ever after. No, they take 300 pages, right, to explore that relationship in a way that is ultimately fulfilling of the trope. The trope exists for a reason. And I think it's not the fact that we want escapism is not somehow bad in and of itself. It's not like we are, like, she keeps making this diet analogy. It's not like we're choosing bad food that tastes good. There is something specific that we are seeking in escapism. And yeah, if you are escaping to abandon your responsibilities, that's not healthy. But escapism entertainment is healthy in a different sort of way. It takes you, removes you from your situation, and ideally presents you with themes, bigger truths about the world, about people, and then you take those back to your life. You should be rejuvenated, should be ready to tackle things. Escapism fiction should revitalize your actual daily life. So there is good escapism entertainment. It's not bad to seek something that you know you're going to enjoy. And if it lists a specific trope you're after, then that's a shortcut between you and your reading experience, not between your brain and like a um like a words just completely failed me here. Bigger truths. Thank you. I'm glad that I'm talking about something concrete, not just rambling on. Hi to Doug Wise. Thank you for coming. Okay. I think I've said enough about that paragraph. Do readers really have a duty to escape? Responding to criticism that fantasy was inherently escapist, Tolkien famously said. And then Ursula K. Le Guin famously paraphrased. And I am hoping that everybody is familiar with these quotes. But, she says, since Tolkien first issued the call for readers to escape, and Le Guin urged them to bring other prisoners of war with them, the landscape of fantasy has changed. YA fantasy alone has dramatically changed from the books I read in high school. In the past 20 years, the genre has undergone slow pornification. Even clean Christian fiction is not immune to an increasing sensualization, which poses unique challenges and temptations for audiences who may consider this content neutral or benign. This is a cop-out, in my opinion. the idea that fiction has become dramatically worse because of pornification, it's not wrong to say that there is more like sensual content, sexual content in books, particularly in books for young adults. That is a true statement. But that is not the kind of fiction that Tolkien or Le Guin were talking about. Their kind of fantasy still exists, right? So the idea that the landscape of fantasy has changed is the entire landscape of all of publishing has changed. We have the internet, we have ebooks, Amazon, everything is way more accessible. And as publishers, right, seek those books that are guaranteed sellers, right? Things like it's a cultivation thing. You'll see it if you go into any Barnes and Noble, they'll have it in like an end cap, and it's like needlessly eight stacks of them. But it started as a web novel, right? So it got picked up by a publisher because tons and tons of people were reading it online. Well, it's a BL, right? It's boys love, and it's fantasy because it's a cultivation novel. But like the progression from the internet to publishing, right? That has changed. That's completely new and different. And yeah, things are not ideal, but that's not really fantasy. That's everything in general. Porn is far more accessible. So I feel like this argument in this context is kind of a cop-out. We could sidestep that entire argument by saying, well, don't read that, right? Don't read porn. Don't read stuff that is inappropriately overstimulating in a sexual way. I don't think that's unfair, right? We would say that you should avoid those kinds of sinful behaviors. And when I talk about this, I want to make a point to say, especially because she mentioned clean Christian fiction, that pornification is not the same as the depiction of sex or sensuality in general. And because she's already blurred the lines between fantasy and the romance genre, it is a little bit harder to like talk about this in a way that's like straightforward. But in a lot of fantasy and sci-fi, traditionally, because you're exploring things in different cultures, in different places, and because you are exploring people, I don't think that it's inappropriate to have human experiences. Obviously, the thematic treatment of those things needs to be appropriate. I talk about this on my website. If you guys are interested in hearing more what I think about that. I was going to check in on the chat. Anne says, don't tell her about those Regency era Gothic romances. And then she says, people think that if it gets clicks, it sells books. One doesn't always equal the other. That's true. Also, who's buying books? People who wolf down trashy romances. Yes, if they're good quality or not. Precisely. Web novel. That's what I'm talking about. And it was not originally in English. So most people wolfed that down with a very, very poor translation. But I think that's the last thing left because people who read have basic standards that are still being met. Yep, people who like other genres are not being served. Yes, basic standards like tropes, right? I would like to see enemies to lovers. Well, you can type that in and it comes right up, right? People know the tropes are touchstones, and that's appropriate. Okay, stories really do reshape our neurochemistry. It's not just that fantasy has changed, readers have changed. Our favorite stories do reshape our brains, and not just for readers of erotic content or romance. Then she talks about neurons and neuroplasticity and your mind and behavior is influenced by your reading. So there's no actual support for readers have changed, except perhaps the conclusion that because the fantasy genre is different and full of porn, readers are changed by that fact. Sure, some people might habitually read that stuff and their minds would be changed by that. But I don't think I agree with the premise that reading changes the way that you think. And this idea that neurons that fire together wire together, that's an important one for escapism fiction, right? That's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. You read about a hero fighting a dragon, and you read about bravery and diligence and responsibility, and then you take that into your own life and you emulate that because you have experienced in a book the stress of coming up against a problem with another character, right? And guided by the author. And then you come against that kind of situation. Obviously, probably you're not actually facing a dragon, but you have that same sort of, okay, I'm confronted with a problem. I have stress in my life. I am doing something that is present like directly addressing a problem. And instead of doing like sort of destructive behaviors, I try and emulate the heroic behaviors that I've read about because my brain has been thinking in that pathway, right? So I agree with that. I don't know that I agree that quote unquote readers have changed in the I don't know that I have any concrete example of that from her article, is what I'm trying to say, I guess. Okay, favorite books constitute your sociocultural diet and affect your psychological and psychological states, like sugar and carbs, which generate cravings for more sugar and carbs. The books you reach for will produce cravings for similar kinds of books, which in turn reinforce your preferences for those books. Maybe. Maybe not. I read a ton of historical novels as a high schooler. Maybe even earlier than that. Middle school. I don't read that stuff anymore. I read some of it, but that's not a genre that appeals to me anymore. People change over the course of their lives as they encounter new things or as they reach different life stages. They look for different things. So books are not sugar and carbs. So I understand the analogy, but I don't think that she has created enough to support that analogy is an appropriate one. Here we come to the part that I'm like, in hard seasons, don't just escape, seek better nourishment. Please don't assume I'm some kind of health warrior who brings celery sticks and hummus to the cinema and extols the virtues of colloidal silver. That's one I haven't heard before. Occasionally, I still eat junk food and enjoy a just for comfort book. To paraphrase C.S. Lewis, if the book does not celebrate pride, lust, or immorality, it's not necessarily a bad book. Books need not all be overtly moral or religious. You sound like a health warrior. and being like, I still occasionally eat junk food doesn't convince me that you're not a health warrior. And how do you define a just for comfort book? What does that mean? I think that is a missing piece here. If a book does not celebrate sin, it's not necessarily a bad book. So what is a bad book that does not celebrate sin? Because I agree, books do not need to be overtly moral or religious. In fact, it's better if the story is about something else and the characters can be overtly Christian or have overt morals, or be religious, and the themes can support that without it being a lecture. And it will be a good book, right? A book that is nourishing and edifying. So the line, right, between escapism and healthy is not well defined here. And William Jeffrey Rankin points out, is she equating just for comfort with escapism? Because that's not necessarily true either. You're right. Anne says, this reminds me of a line from the Cranford TV series when the harsh older woman said she only read Samuel Johnson and condemned someone's love of Dickens as sadly popular. Taste enters into this a lot. We're going to get to some really interesting questions here in a minute. These days, just like I'm more aware of what substances I put into my body, I'm more aware of what I'm feeding my mind. I'm aware of my vulnerabilities that lead to those comfort food desires. I know that when I'm sick or else craving cheese toasties or ice cream, I instead need the nourishment of chicken soup for my body and spiritual food for my mind, best of all, the Bible. Okay. You should be aware of yourself as a reader. I don't think that's inappropriate to say. And you should be aware of your vulnerabilities and the things that you reach for when you are low, when you are not vulnerable, but when you are weak. Let's say it like that. And you should absolutely be reading your Bible. Absolutely. Never hear me say that you shouldn't be reading your Bible. You should be reading your Bible. Most of all, because that is going to tell you whether or not your escapism fiction is true, right? And is promoting truth. Either sort of nourishment rewrites my neural pathways. My brain learns that when I've had a hard day, I don't always need comfort food or an imaginative escape. That is so wrong. Because it's like I've been saying, right? Escapism should be that what you take your mind out of your hard day and you say, okay, here's the pattern that I want to emulate. And yes, you have to be proactive about the kinds of things that you pick up. You can't pick up nihilism, right? You can't pick up postmodernism. It should be true escapism. It should be something that is extolling virtues and imbuing your values back into you in such a way that you can then like reset your focus. You should be like I've been saying, right? Re-energized, after a hard day. This is an appropriate thing to do. And yes, if you've had a hard day, reaching for your Bible is also appropriate. But reaching for an escapism piece of fiction, which is talking to you thematically truths that you are familiar with in your Bible, right? That is also appropriate. Instead, I can reach for a book that helps me lean into discomfort and find healing. What does that mean? I would like to see examples. This improves my emotional resilience and changes how I respond to hardships. Escapism fiction does that in concrete ways. This bothers me. What about escapism that isn't romance or that kind of romance? This is an excellent question. Even if you don't struggle with the escapism of erotica or sensual stories, you might have experienced the tendency to revel in safer, easy stories. Even the reverse of this, like hard-hitting tales that cause you emotional turmoil, can bring the same results. Either way, here are some questions to consider. But what about escapism that isn't romance or that kind of romance, right? Why is Lord of the Rings, say, right? Since we're talking escapism, and let's give a concrete example of something that isn't that kind of romance, what wouldn't be appropriate about choosing to escape in that way? That's not really explained. Here are the funny. Here are the questions that do you only read books with particular tropes or by particular authors? Yes. Do you prefer simple/shorter rather than more complex/longer? Although longer doesn't always necessarily mean more complex. Yes. George Orwell's Animal Farm is an excellent example of this. So do I prefer simple, shorter rather than complex, longer? Yes. For nonfiction readers, do you only read books by authors you agreed with? Yes. For fiction readers, do you only read books with happily ever afters or known formulaic endings? Yes, right? There's a reason that we do that. Because that would be escapism. And the formula, right, is part of the escape. There are tropes and things that stories that follow a particular pattern exist for a reason. And it's not just escapism, although they provide escapism. And books that don't end happily ever after or subvert the formula are not necessarily healthier. And then this last one is, do you prefer books that wreck you or make you anxious? That's not a thing for me. But that, I guess, is her question that gets at the reverse. I don't see these as being safe or easy. And the reason is that when I reach for a book and my goal with fiction is to be entertained, I am reaching for things that I would like to know what the book is about. Part of that is the author saying, here are some tropes that you're going to run into in the blurb, in the marketing. I read stuff by authors that I've read before because I know that I'm going to enjoy stuff that they've read and that they've written because I liked the first one, right? And yeah, I read a lot of new authors that I've never heard of before, and that doesn't necessarily mean that I am sort of stretching my brain in healthy ways or anything. That's just something that a goal and a personal value that I hold, right? I would like to support as many indie authors and share them with as many readers as possible. But it's not inappropriate to reach for things that sound familiar. Uh, it would be weird to seek out stuff that I didn't think was going to be entertaining. Uh, and in the context of like healthy, there isn't necessarily a clear line, right? Who's to say that the tropes I enjoy and the authors that I enjoy are not healthy? Because she hasn't given me any guidelines other than don't read porn. Um, I'm very intentional about the books that I read. I'm looking for specific tropes. I'm looking for specific themes. I quit stuff. I quit 2 books within the first 3 pages. It just was pretty obvious to me that the content was not going to be appropriate for me, right? I it's and I lean towards shorter stuff over longer stuff because I want to I enjoy a good long fantasy, right? So um that's from being a fantasy whale reader, right? But a lot of indie stuff is leaning towards shorter and it's a lot punchier, right? It's a lot slimmer and and uh like it's leaner and it's not, you know, they're not necessarily better than the longer ones, but a lot of times they have more um they're more manageable. I I'm an adult, right? I have things going on in my life. 600 pages or more is great. That'll set me up for weeks, right? But like I'm like a diligent reader. That's what I spend my free time doing as opposed to watching TV or doing other relaxing activities. So other people who like my father-in-law who only reads in the waiting room would be something that he works through for years. Uh, so I don't it's the idea of something being shorter slash simpler being wrong. That is also or being less healthy. That's also not a good metric. Um, I don't know why she even bothered talking about nonfiction because that's not escapism. But like when I'm reading nonfiction, I'm usually reading something like a parenting book or um, a theology book. Like I'm reading What About Evil right now, right? Like I'm not really interested in reading something by somebody who has a different set of values to me when I'm reading nonfiction. So that one seems really odd to me. And then, of course, I've already talked about happily ever afters or formulaic endings. Okay, gonna check in with the chat. You guys are great. And is this like one of those Christian self-help books? Because yikes. Oh dear, if you read nothing but books about knights, that's okay, unless you're Don Quixote, that still is right. Also, if the questions are about that kind of romance, shouldn't be asking yourself if they are explicit or contain abuse or glorify unhealthy relationships or something, right? Like the thematic treatment of content is important. It's not irrelevant. So I feel like these questions, without overtly laying out guidelines, sort of imply, right? Like if you answered, she never even says, right? She's like, if you answered yes to any of these questions, you should just, here are some questions to consider. As, but she has not actually said any any like, here's what is a healthy book. Different needs call for different books. Once again, I don't believe it's bad to reach for familiar or comfort stories or to reread beloved classics. Kind of a nice quote here. There must always be two kinds of art. Escape art, for man needs escape as he needs food and deep sleep. And parable art, that art which shall teach man to unlearn hatred and learn love. That's a really nice like explanation of like escapism versus healthy, if that's what she's talking about. The problem is, right? I think that good escapism fiction, especially if we're talking in the context of sci-fi fantasy, is art that teaches values, virtues. They're not inseparable, or they're not mutually exclusive. These choices call for wisdom. Obviously, I would advocate that readers know themselves and choose books accordingly. In a cultural landscape that now heavily promotes escape art over parable art, what stories do you prefer the most? I would not say that our culture promotes escape art. I would say our culture promotes like uh well, erotica. Look at Amazon, any Amazon category. What fictional influences do you permit to shape your brain and therefore your behavior? That is a good question and an important one for self-reflection. And I think that because I disagree with most of her conclusions, that does not mean that this is not an appropriate question to be asking. There is healthy fiction. I would agree with that. I would agree that there's unhealthy fiction as well. But escapism does not necessarily equate to unhealthy or to only like not parable art or whatever that means. I think it's an important to consider. And like we said earlier, you should know yourself and know the kinds of proclivities you have when you are in like at the end of a long day, a hard day, or when you are feeling spiritually weak. You should know the kinds of things that are going to be appropriate for you to nourish yourself. That doesn't mean that escapism fiction isn't one of those appropriate things. Porn would not be an appropriate thing, but sin would not be an appropriate thing. Finding your way to nourishing reading choices. We need many kinds of stories to grow, both the familiar and the strange, the kind of strangeness that helps us make sense of the familiar. Fantastical stories are exceptionally good at offering us both. Yes. That is something that is a true statement about what makes fantasy and sci-fi particularly effective as escapism. This year, I encourage you to examine your cultural diet. What is your protein, which keeps you feeling full for longer? How nutritious are your fruit and veggies? Do you always reach for what you feel like and never for what your body really needs? Again, my biggest problem here is that she makes the assumption that escapism is not the appropriate choice here, or is not a nutritious, healthy, appropriate choice. Consider the stories that live in you and whether they make your mind and spirit sick or healthy. And again, that's an appropriate call to action. I think that's good. I think I've used the word appropriate a lot here. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Those would be the real red flags. Yep, talking about the way that, um, the things that that kind of romance are promoting. Excuse me, sorry, guys. William said, Jeffrey Rankin says she's hitting the nourishment metaphor so hard. Yes, she is, to the detriment of the article. I would agree. I think that the overall idea that you should be examining what you take in and and uh, vetting appropriately the kinds of books you read is good. The criticism of escapism fiction is a completely different article, and the muddying of the two didn't work for me. I think promoted some wrong uh, incorrect ideas about escapism, and I think shied away from addressing concrete ideas about healthy reading and self-examination and stuff. I wanted to bring another article up. This one was published last year, almost a year ago. And it came up because some people were being critical of the subversive movement. And I think that this is a very meaty article about the subversive movement. But I think it provides a little bit of a counterpoint to the Lorehaven article. So this is Lit Rebellion. So it's by Brandon Queckler, May 18th, 2023. Subversive art is everywhere. There must logically be equal and opposite art. So here, this is laying out a counter movement to art subversion, kind of in the same category as nihilism and postmodernism. Talk pretty concretely about what subversion is. I'll read this in a minute. But if we are talking about healthy fiction versus unhealthy fiction, I think that this kind of dividing line is much more concretely helpful than a sort of general sci-fi fantasy escapism is not necessarily good for you. So Tom Simon explained this subversion as to subvert a thing literally means to turn from below, to undermine. In olden days, men built their forts and castles on high ground because high ground is easier to defend. A hilltop fortress can be made almost impregnable, but only almost, for a fortress can be undermined. The attacking army digs tunnels underneath the fortifications, scooping out the earth and rock until the walls cave in from their own unsupported weight. This is the original kind of subversion. This kind of subversion, this is end of the quote. This kind of subversion isn't talking about subverting expectations. It's describing undermining the foundational norms that societies rest on. Excuse me. So goes on to talk more about the way, like, virtually everything derived from Tolkien is garbage or mire, like that. And then talks about a specific example in the form of a song. I think that's really appropriate. But it talks about institutions like the family being attacked, virtues being attacked, stories that aren't telling truth or promoting goodness. Behaviors that are evil. And then the potential for redeeming moments is sidestepped, and any moral is nullified. I think that's talking about stories that are subverting things that are good, things that are true. That is far more unhealthy than familiar tropes. Makes a really nice point here. Don't dwell on subversive art. Shine a light on it, sure, but subversive art simply isn't good art. Don't consume so much that you fall into despair. All that subversion needs to work is attention. Subversion will work on you even though you recognize the evil. It's almost like Medusa. Keep subversion at a distance so it doesn't overcome you. And then talks about superversion as the antidote to the sort of creeping evil of subversion, right? The destruction. So how do we address the problem? The antidote for destruction is to build. Quotes LJ Lamplighter. She's great. I had her on when I did the Iron Age Maiden stream. It was wonderful to have her there because she has been publishing good indie stuff, right? In this sort of movement over time, right? So it was great to have her. If subversion is changing something by undercutting it from below, superversion is change by inspiring from above. Our norms come from our culture. Our culture comes from our art. Our art must be based on truth. Truth comes from God. This is how superversive works. That is a wonderful progression, in my opinion. A superversive story teaches and inspires. It shows us what our culture should be, builds up our cultural foundations by sharing goodness, showing beauty, and speaking truth. Okay. Then talks about a parable as an example and some Bible passages. You should definitely read them. I'm not going to sit on them overlong now. A story can't be superversive unless it's telling the truth. Art that is true can also be beautiful and good. It can inspire people. It builds our culture. And by building our culture, it counteracts subversion. I think this was a really nice article. Every question it asked, it answered in a concrete way. I think that it laid out clearly what the elements of a subversive, unhealthy story is, and then what the counter elements of a good and healthy story would be. And appropriately, right, escapism that encompasses those elements would be healthy. A story that doesn't have those elements would not be healthy. I think that is far, far more concrete and understandable than escapism, which the water is muddy for a lot of people on what exactly is escapism fiction. Because obviously Tolkien and Le Guin were thinking about something very different than the women who read web novels, right? And use the words escape in a very similar but uh, like within very important differences, like that context. Okay. Thank you guys so much for sticking out with me. That is the article that I wanted to talk to you guys about, and I hope that I didn't ramble too much and that I addressed the points of the article in a way that made sense. And I hope that you guys do reach for escapism that is healthy, because it's important to read fiction and good, healthy fiction. But I think that we should be thinking about these things in very concrete terms and not in general terms. It's not helpful to think about healthy as being things that are hard, and unhealthy being something that's easy. My kids love peas. I hate peas, but they love them, right? So that saying, well, if you like it so much and you would like to just eat only peas on your plate, right? Well, that must be, then peas are unhealthy, right? Like that's not how health works. I think that it's only going to help to talk about things in a way that is more specific, because I think it is important to think about the kinds of things that we're putting into our bodies, because I agree with the like the title of the article that that stories do affect the way that our brains work and approach problems, the sort of assumptions that we make about other people, about ourselves, about problems, and about the entire world, right? Because stories can reach into so much. And I think that second article that talks about, it's talking specifically about the superversive movement, but talking about the opposite of subversion, right? I think that is a better way of thinking about what is healthy escapism fiction than just sort of suggesting that escapism is no longer the same as what Tolkien was saying, but not really defining it. I don't think that's helpful. Thanks, William Jeffrey Rankin. Second article looks great. Good. I felt like it was an appropriate juxtaposition of articles, so I'm glad that you liked it. Okay, I am going to call it a night. Thank you guys so much. I did not do news or upcoming review. So was it last week or the week before? I did like a big, all of the news that I've missed while I was sick, right? So I encourage you guys to check that out. I am currently doing editing, so some of my time is being taken up by that. I don't have a upcoming review right now. I have several like series that I've read and would like to do reviews of, like the second and third books. That's kind of what I've been doing lately, is kind of reading through some of the series that I've reviewed the first book. But so that's what I've been reaching for lately. Authors that I'm familiar with, books that I'm fairly certain are gonna hit it right for me. So eventually those will come down the pipeline. And then I have a couple of author interviews that I would like to do coming up here. So lots on the docket. I'm really excited that I'm getting back into streaming and having fun. And it would have been 2 weeks ago because last week we did a book haul. That was fun. Okay. Thank you guys so much. If you guys are interested, you find like an article that you think is an appropriate thing for us to talk about, feel free to send it to me or tag me. I particularly like articles like this that are talking to readers and not to writers in general. It is much more applicable to me, and I think that there's kind of a lack of reader focused content that I would like to try and fill some of that void with things that aren't book talk videos, if that makes sense. Yeah. All right. PerryEpsisPress.com is my website where I review indie sci-fi and fantasy. And if you guys are interested, I'm on Twitter at RedHedgeDragon. All right, you guys have a great night. I really appreciate my chat. Mostly William and Anne, who've been with me and have been providing excellent commentary. I appreciate you guys' participation. Okay, everybody have a great night.